The following content is in UHD HDR10. There are some SDR clips in a HDR sequence. SDR version is in Rec. 709 Gamma 2.4 100 nits limited in a HDR Rec. 2100 ST2084. The goal is to simulate an accurate comparison of the display of the same source in HDR on a HDR TV and in SDR on a SDR TV side by side. This content must be watched on a HDR display. It will be available to download on lelabodejet.com in HEVC HDR10. The following content was recorded in French. This is an English dub version. I apologize for my accent and approximative English and of course the total lack of sync. Hope you will enjoy anyway.
Cette vidéo vous est offerte par SOS CINE. SOS CINE, agence de location audiovisuelle sur Paris et Lyon, partenaire de la création.
Hello to all of you and welcome to my YouTube channel, Le Labo de Jay. I'm very happy to find you for this exceptional content. Let's talk about HDR again. With a 4K video in HDR, we will talk about metadata, black levels, white levels, color space and number of nits. In short, a lot of things about HDR. We will also talk about artistic intent, we'll talk about fake HDR and we'll create a content in do-it-yourself mode. We will grade it on Davinci Resolve with the Dolby Vision workflow. We'll make an HDR sequence that you can download on my website lelabodejet.com. In short, you will be super spoiled. But first, jingle intro. Hello and welcome everyone, this is going to be a special video because we will try to demystify HDR. When I say demystify, we will answer some of the questions you may have. We are going to sweep away the urban legends. I'll try to explain again what is HDR to answer some controversies. More and more people are talking about fake HDR and I have a vision that is completely different from that. And I want to share it with you. And to share it with you and to express it and document it, I'm going to recreate an HDR content for you. I'm lucky to have partners like SOS CINE, who provide me with equipment like a RED Gemini, so we're going to shoot some elements. We'll develop them in Resolve and grade them, and we will redo a Dolby Vision workflow. Thanks to the help of people at Dolby who have been following me for a while now, and above all, I have the incredible luck to have had access to incredible equipment. ESO friends lend me 2 monitors. One which I will use as SDR monitor and the other which I will use as HDR monitor. Let's go. Before getting into the heart of the matter, I'm just going to give you a very quick reminder of some very important notions. I invite you to watch the previous video I made on HDR and I'm not going to redetail everything, but already it will give you a good base. An image will be displayed on a display system, whether it's a TV, a phone, a computer, or in a theater using a projector. In each case, we have a totally different system and color space. The main characteristics that will define the image are the gamut, the transfer curve, and the white point. The whole of it will define a color space. The gamut is a set of colors that can be reproduced by a device. It could be a TV, a camera, or a projector. According to this device, the gamut can be more or less large. On this CINE diagram, we represent all the colors perceived by the human vision. For SDR TV, we have the BT709 which covers 38.7% of the CINE diagram. For cinema, we have DCI-P3 which covers 41.7%. And for HDR, we have the BT2020 that covers 57.2%. For HDR, there's a small subtlety, but we'll come back later to it. The transfer curve will convert a light intensity into an electrical signal, then convert this electrical signal into a light intensity to display an image on a display system. For SDR, we talk about gamma curve 2.2, 2.4 or BT1886. We can see that the curve does not exceed 100 nits. The BT1886 takes into account technical characteristics of your display system. It is supposed to create coherence between several display systems on the restitution of the same content. For HDR, we speak of EOTF PQ curve, which will allow to code its bit values between 1 and 1000 nits. It's an absolute curve. For HLG, we have the curve ARIB STD B67, an hybrid log gamma curve that will allow coding value up to 5000 nits. Finally, the white point will define the warm or cold aspect of your image when the RGB values are identical. The white point is expressed in Kelvin. We have D65 for screens, and for the cinema we have virtual white point that we can place where we want. We have reference values like D63 or D60. Tone mapping and roll-off are operations performed by consumer display systems in order to take the original signal and convert it to characteristics of your display system. They are based on the information contained in the metadata. If the original signal has a maximum light peak at 1000 nits, for example, and your TV can only display 500, the tone mapping and the roll-off will convert the signal and bring it back to 500 nits. If you have static metadata, conversion will be applied to the whole content, and if you have dynamic metadata, conversion will be done where it's needed. The difference between HDR and SDR is in the highlights mainly. It will be the way to display and code the highlights. You really have to see HDR as an extension of SDR, that is to say, everything you have in the midtones and darktones will be displayed the same way. Except in extreme cases when you have particular colors, but the majority of the signal will be displayed the same way. Where it will differ is in the highlights, and it's precisely in these optics that the PQ curve was developed. It is to allow you to display more information in the highlights. For display system, we don't talk about dynamic range, but contrast ratio. Dynamic range is what you will have with camera sensor. Now with your contrast ratio, you must know that sometimes you see numbers like 1 under 1 million. You must be aware of how are made these measures. That is to say that the manufacturer will send a very bright white image on the screen by making certain settings, and then he will make another adjustment to send a very black image, which will allow you to obtain a very high contrast ratio. Except that in real life, your difference between the darkest and the highest pixel is on the same image. So the measure will be different. So the contrast ratio they sell you, it's not necessary and relative and adequate to what happens in real life. So let's try to simplify. In SDR, the signal is graded on reference screen in Rec. 709 Gamma 2.4. It is calibrated to display for 100% of the signal a white peak at 100 nits. We can still have SDR screens that display range up to 200 or 250 nits. So technically, in SDR we do not refer to nits, and there is no limitation in terms of signal, just reference values. We have a signal that will be displayed using a gamma curve that is relative. The intensities will vary and adapt according to the system on which they will be displayed. In HDR, we will grade on a calibrated screen with a minimal black level at 0.005 nits, and for 100% of the signal it will represent 1000 nits. Unlike SDR, the display of SDR is done with a PQ curve that is absolute. This means that for 100 nits on the curve must correspond 100 nits on the display. We do not have this equivalence in SDR. If we have a solid white diffuse without reflection in SDR, it will represent the maximum white that can be displayed at 100 nits. Obviously, on SDR TVs today we can have values higher than 100 nits, but we cannot display any saturation beyond this value. In HDR, we set the value of diffuse white to 203 nits, to avoid having an image too dark. This value also applies to white text. This value corresponds to TV whose peak light is at 1000 nits. It evolves according to the capacity of the restitution of your display system. By setting this white level to 203 nits in HDR, for the PQ curve it represents 58% of the signal, and in HRG it represents 75% of the signal. First of all, there is no such thing as deep black. Except if you lock yourself in a room without windows, without light, without anything at all, or even if you go into space. But from the moment you have a source, the black at zero does not exist. So when we talk about a very deep black, it's a black that has been modified. It has been voluntarily lowered. One of the things you must know is that more you lower the signal, the less detail you will have in this signal. When you want to display a black that is down to zero, then you'll have to lower the signal. Of course, you will alter the black level nuances that are close to these values. So the other concern is that you are told that HDR brings you deeper blacks. It's false, for the good and simple reason that your black level is dependent on your display system. You can have black as deep in HDR as in SDR if you watch on an OLED. On the other hand, if you look on an LCD or rotten, your level of black can be in HDR, it will be rotten. All these curves code the intensities differently. The lowest level of black is identical. What will change is the restitution of details in the dark areas. The PQ curve is supposed to display more information, thus increasing the feeling of depth. And the other thing that will have an impact really important on the black levels, it's your viewing conditions. The HDR, the way PQ-ST2084 curve has been defined, is made to be viewed with a brightness about 5 nits. That is to say, you have to watch this limit in twilight, as in the cinema. An image is made to be looked at with the least possible visual pollution. Why do Dolby theaters offer such a high contrast level? It's not with extreme light intensities. 108 nits is the maximum. It's not huge, it's just above the SDR. But on the other hand, it goes down very low in the black level, because they are able to control the visual and light pollution in the room. The more light pollution you have, the more your black level will suffer. If you look at a dark image on an OLED, in an environment where there is a lot of light pollution, what happens? Well, you have the whole room reflected in the black parts of your screen. This is where there is a big difference between HDR and SDR. On SDR, we have the possibility to change the ETF curve. When you look at your TV settings, you can have gamma 2.2, gamma 2.4. We can raise or lower the signal depending on the ambient brightness. You can't do this with HDR. Why? Because as I told you before, the PQ curve is absolute. The values that are coded correspond to particular need values. And we can't modify this curve. So we can't. Yes, we can because Dolby found the solution. It released Dolby Vision IQ in order to enhance the whole signal if you are in a brighter room. Same with HDR10 Plus Adaptive, it does exactly the same thing. But don't be fooled, it's a tweak of the PQ curve, no more, no less. By doing this, we modify the signal. We are not at all in what we had at the base. Before we were watching this image on TV, now a lot of people watch on computer, laptop or even phone, in conditions that are not necessarily optimal, that is to say they can watch in broad daylight anywhere. And so when you watch in daylight, you have pollution. So they will try to provide you with a signal that is brighter and screens that are brighter, but sorry, it doesn't make sense. We can't tell you on the end that you're going to have deeper blacks, knowing that you are looking at daylight and that all you will see in your deep blacks is the reflection of the room. No, really no. No TV is able to display BT 2020 correctly. Not even the reference monitors. Some examples among many others? A Sony X950H covers 91.01% of DCI-P3 and 67.14% of BT 2020. A Sony HDR 94.50% of DCI-P3 and 67.40% of BT 2020. A Samsung RU9000 90.86% of DCI-P3 and 67.55% of BT 2020. The Samsung Q90T 89.13% of DCI-P3 and 67.24% of BT 2020. LG Nano 90 63.33% of BT 2020. Finally, LG CX 71.67% of BT 2020. So what's going on? Your content are mastered in P3 D65. We are not using the RED 2020 primaries, we are going to use the RED 2020 as a container. And the content will be graded in P3 D65, encapsulated in a BT 2020, for majority of them. For Dolby Vision mastering, the gamut used is P3 D65. Content from Netflix are made from P3 D65. The P3 is significantly larger than Rec. 709 in terms of gamut. But not all TVs are capable of displaying 100% of P3. The difference between these gamuts, between Rec. 709 and DCI-P3, is done on particular portion of the colors. Telling you that you will have more colors, yes, but that will be function of the content you will look at. Sure, if you are watching a wildlife documentary in the jungle, you will be able to display super saturated greens. That you can't display in Rec. 709, we agree. Same if you watch Matrix, you might get a better rendition with the P3 than with the Rec. 709, we agree. But Paulette and Jean-Jacques breaking up on a winter's night in their 2-room apartment in Paris, I'm not sure you will see the difference between P3 and Rec. 709. Where there's a real difference is the switch from 8-bit to 10-bit encoding. So on the same content, if you don't have astronomical colors, you will have more details, more nuances, and you will have less posterization effect. For me, HDR is a globality, it's not just dynamic range. It's the dynamic range, the color, but also the encoding. It's the color depth, the compression that is much better than what you have in SDR content. With the same image, you still have something that is of better quality in HDR than in SDR, and not just for a story of dynamic range. The number of nits is not necessarily a guarantee of quality, and it can even be a problem. Don't forget that you have a lot of TVs which are not able to display extreme light intensity. When we talk about values like 1000 nits, it's on the tiny portions of the image. It's brightness in small localized areas, but not on the whole image. Your TV is not able to display 1000 nits on a big area for a long time. It's for sure that you will damage your TV, it's not made for that. So this will allow me to make the link with the next point, which is the metadata. What are the metadata? They are the informations of the system with which the image was graded and created, to display it depending on the characteristics of your display system. It will allow to create the link between the original signal and what your display system can display, and to modify this content to fit in the specs of your display system. The more powerful your signal will be in the input, and if your display system cannot display all the intensities, the more you will twist the signal. And if you don't have dynamic metadata, that is to say a shot-by-shot analysis, the static metadata will affect all the content. And you may have a darker image. The more nits you have in the input, the more you risk to have problems if you are on a TV that is not able to display as much information. The metadata at the base is served for that. They are used to protect your display system. Movies are great on reference monitors. On this reference monitor, there is no need for metadata since it's the reference monitor that is able to display full signal. Once the signal is encoded and compressed, it will arrive at your home, and there with your TV, you will need metadata to know how to display the signal. Now, one thing you should know is that if you had a TV that could display the same thing as the mastering monitor, same color volume, same number of nits, the metadata, you don't need it. When I did part 3 on HDR with the sequence I created, I went to a store to test on different TVs. This is something I didn't communicate so much about because, to be honest, that experience was quite complex for me. Since I created this content, I knew the images by heart. I knew exactly how it should look like. Well, when I tested on different TVs, it was a cold shower. Because none of them gave me the image I wanted to see. There were differences between these TVs that were sometimes quite huge. There were models that interpreted the signal really badly, whether in HDR10 or even in Dolby Vision. So it was really a kind of shock. I said to myself, HDR is very good, but in fact, it's very complicated. It's very complicated to have the famous respect of artistic intent. Because of the fact that the tone mapping is not standardized, except for Dolby, each manufacturer will develop and display the PQ signal with his own source. And as a result, we don't have consistency and something homogeneous from one brand to another. We really have real differences. So knowing who's right and who's wrong, it's very complicated. Obviously, the consumer does not realize it because he doesn't know what the content looks like in the first place. He has no idea what the original image is. He will only see what is displayed on this TV, saying to himself, "Whoa, this image is beautiful," but maybe this image is far from the original look. At least with SDR, it was not necessarily simple, but we managed to calibrate TVs correctly. But with HDR, calibration is more complex, and from one brand and one model to another, we can have very different results. So one of the problems of these stores is that the manufacturers ask that the TVs be forced into demo mode. That is to say that they will display the image with presets which will tend to boost the image to flatter it. It will otherwise increase the contrast, increase the saturation, the brightness. In short, the goal is to make the image as flattering as possible. By doing this, they distort the signal. The representation that is made of the image is not the closest to the reality. But then, consumers sees it in the stores. This is the first contact he has with HDR. The image that is sold to him This is this super flattering image. The marketing campaigns, when you have a new 4K HDR stock that is going to be released, they show you the before in SDR and the after in HDR. The SDR, as it is presented to you, we have the impression that it's almost black and white, it's completely unsaturated and it has low contrast compared to the new version, which is really much more flashy, and that's where we have a real problem. The consumer who will buy 4K HDR, who is going to buy a TV and who is going to buy media in 4K HDR, is going to expect that from HDR. If we don't give him that, then you will be disappointed. Hence the birth of the fake HDR controversy, because there are contents which do not use the full range that HDR can offer, but are still stamped HDR. And this is a problem for the consumer, because he has the impression of being ripped off. He pays a media that is more expensive, it's true, without having the impression to take advantage of what HDR can bring. What is fake HDR? It is the fact of having a content HDR, content that look like SDR. So to have basically RED 79 in BT 2020 and light intensities that are much lower than 1000 nits. So we will try to deconstruct this story of fake HDR, and to understand it well, we'll try to have a global view of the thing. Trying to summarize this as much as possible, your image you will be able to watch it either on a TV, a computer, a smartphone, a tablet, or in theater. I put aside the video projection because even if we are not identical to TV broadcasts, we start from the same source. Your image comes from a color-graded master. From this master, we will create deliverables. For consumer, we will deliver versions for creating DVD, Blu-ray, and Ultra HD Blu-ray. For streaming platforms, we will deliver what we call an IMF, an interoperable master format. This is a single file that can contain several sound tracks, text tracks, and image tracks. And for theaters, we will deliver either a digital cinema package, a DCP, for digital projections, or film for standard projections. Today you have three main ways to make HDR content. First case, the most common one, we will shoot scenes with digital or film camera and we will edit them. Then we will grade a master from which we will release either a SDR or a HDR version. What you need to understand is that when we grade, we work on elements that have been filmed with camera, which for the vast majority have gamut and dynamic range far above the broadcast standards. You have to make a distinction between two very important things. The scene referred, that is to say elements that have values that correspond to the scenes filmed, and the display referred, which will correspond to the values that are displayed on your display system. And these values are very different from the value found in the scene referred. So in color grading, we will work most often on scene referred elements, so we will be able to deliver both HDR and SDR. And when we make our deliverables, we will adapt the scene referred values in relation to the display referred. And we will be able to output SDR or HDR for cinema or TV. Second case, you have a film master with photochemical grading, that is to say nothing digital. In this case, we will scan the film, we will obtain elements that will offer all the necessary latitude to produce a new HDR version. And third case, we only have a SDR master that we want to transform into HDR. Thanks to complex process, we will try to find the original information of the image before it was finalized in SDR in order to have the material to make a new HDR image. This is called inverse tone mapping. So I would like to draw your attention to the fact that some contents are made in this way with automated processes, which can lead to disappointing HDR results. But this is a minority. For SDR digital cinema, the signal is between 0 and 48 nits. This is the standard in projection. Regarding the color, we master in P3, associated with a gamma of 2.6. For HDR, we have IMAX laser with a 75 nits maximum peak brightness, P3 primaries with a gamma 2.6 curve, Eclair color with 103 nits maximum peak brightness, P3 primaries with gamma 2.8 curve, Dolby Cinema with 108 nits maximum peak brightness, BT 2020 primaries with PQ curve, Onyx with 300 nits maximum peak brightness with P3 primaries and PQ curve, or the use of standard Eclair color. For consumer devices, we have SDR with 100 maximum peak brightness, the use of RED 79 primaries with a gamma curve either 2.2, 2.4 or BT 1886. For HDR, it's a little more complex. You have HDR 10, 10+, Dolby Vision, SLHDR 1 and 2. They are all based on the curve PQ-ST 2084. So most of the HDR contents are mastered with a maximum peak brightness at 1000 nits. Some contents, especially those made with Dolby Vision standard, are mastered with a peak brightness at 4000 nits. But it's not impossible to find some movies in HDR10 with values like 10,000 nits. Then for HLG, the curve used is STD-B67. It's specific to HLG and offers a maximum light intensity of 5000 nits. It concerns HLG and SLHDR3. As mentioned before, the vast majority of the content are mastered in P3 in a BT2020 container. You can see here the representation of the light intensity for the same image in SDR, then HDR for cinema, and HDR for display-like television. And similarly, here is the representation of the same image in HDR with BT2020 gamut, P3, and Rec 709 SDR. And to be quite complete, so that you can see the number of deliverables which are sometimes requested for the same movie, you have for digital cinema standard and 3D version, with P3 primaries Gamma 2.6 at 48 nits max peak brightness. You can have a Dolby 3D version, an IMAX 2D or 3D version. For standard cinema you have 35mm and sometimes 70mm, and 65mm for IMAX 2D and 3D version. For the physical support you have the DVD in Rec 601 D65 Gamma 2.2 limited to 100 nits, Blu-ray in Rec 709 D65 Gamma 2.2 limited in 100 nits. You have the IMF that we talked about before. And for HDR in digital cinema we have the Dolby, Eclair Color, IMAX Laser, Onyx, and for TV you have Ultra HD Blu-ray and IMF with BT2020, P3, D65 with PQ or HLG, with various flavors like HDR10, 10+, Dolby Vision, SLHDR 1, 2 and 3. As you can see, we have a lot of deliverables, with very different intensities. So obviously, the perception of an image in a cinema and in front of a TV is not at all the same, but the whole problem will be to find a coherence between these different worlds. So necessarily, when we go from the cinema version to the TV HDR version, we are not at all on the same levels and on the same intensities. You will have understood that most of the films we watch, which were originally released in theaters, when it comes in 4K HDR, you have two solutions. Either we will stick to the basic artistic intention, and we'll try to have something that is not fundamentally different from what we had in theaters, or we can make an HDR version by pushing the knobs to the max, and then we'll have a real difference with what we saw in theaters. After, obviously, it depends on the kind of film, and it depends on the basic image. When consumer buys a movie in HDR, he wants to be amazed. But why should the SDR version should be different from the SDR? And why would I buy a more expensive TV in 4K HDR, and why would I buy a more expensive Blu-ray than the SDR version, if this difference is not so huge? So basically, you have the possibility to do a not too aggressive HDR color grading, or you can push the knobs and make a top HDR demo. But is this going to respect the basic artistic intent? Well, not necessarily. When you want to have a coherent film with the respect of the artistic intention, then you come up against the consumer who says that it looks like SDR, it's not HDR, it's fake HDR, it's a scam. So we are going to look at this fake HDR, and we are going to go back briefly on two films that have created the polemic, namely Last Jedi and Blade Runner 2049. So Last Jedi by Rian Johnson. It has been strongly criticized. Simply because the film does not present extreme light intensity, we do not exceed 250 nits, and we can say that the use of the white gamut was very big on this movie. By simplification, this is fake HDR. You have to know that the cinematographer is Steve Yedlin. He's just a big shot. They have mixed on this film digital and film cameras. They have an amazing workflow. I wanted to make a video on this film. I was in contact with Walter Volpato, the colorist, Joseph Slomka, the color scientist, and I started to exchange by mail with Steve Yedlin. Unfortunately, this had to stop because all of these people have signed NDAs with Disney, so they were not allowed to talk about the technique and the way films are made. This being said, the creation of this film is really something absolutely incredible. You should take a look at Steve Yedlin's website. There is a demonstration that he made by filming elements with RE, RED, Sony and 35mm cameras. He mixes it all together, he explains how he can match digital camera with film camera, with a workflow on Nuke just crazy. It's really high technicality, it's awesome. All this to tell you that Steve Yedlin is recognized as a leader in his field. The people who work on this film are top-notch. The workflow is done by ILM. If they decide at some point that their film would have a maximum intensity of 250 nits, it's not to rip you off. It's not to say we'll sell 4K HDR Blu-rays by doing SDR and we'll make money on your back. No, that's not how it works. We have a director who had an idea in the beginning, and his idea was to stick to the look of Empire Strikes Back. Empire Strikes Back is not a super saturated and super bright movie. Same thing with Last Jedi, we are in the same vein. We've got a movie that's coming out with a look, we are going to have a Blu-ray that's going to look pretty much the same, so the 4K HDR version has no reason to be fluorescent. It has no reason to be hyper-saturated and to have nit levels that explode in all directions. They want to maintain a consistency of artistic intent, and frankly, it's to their credit. I don't see why a movie that I go to see in theaters will be completely different when I watch it at home on my TV. So now let's talk about Blade Runner 2049. Same thing, the movie has been murdered because it's fake HDR. So for those of you who don't know, I invite you to check out the IMDb page of cinematographer Roger Deakins. This guy is a living legend. He signed the most beautiful images of last years. He doesn't like HDR, he doesn't hide it. But can we really say that Blade Runner is fake HDR? I mean, look at these images. This is in the mist. There's nothing in this image that justifies having extreme intensity, there is no high dynamic range here. Of course everything is milky and misty. It's not fake HDR, it's the image, it's the intention that is like this. This image has been criticized for having lights at 200 nits instead of 1000. Excuse me, but if lights were at 1000 nits, it will kill our eyes. And then what is important in the picture? Lights or Ryan Gosling? We touch on something that amazes me. Why are we going to analyze the values of an image? We are told the story is the major point. It's the character and not the intensity of the two spots on the ceiling. I mean, this is crazy. It's the same, the scene is absolutely beautiful. The integration of 3D elements and visual effects are just awesome. And they criticize this scene for not having light elements higher than 2 or 300 nits? But no, there's no reason. I mean, look at this girl in tutu. In the middle, if you put this element at more than 500 nits, you will lose all the detail in the hologram. You won't have any material left in the hologram, it's a question of common sense. This image is superbly well composed. Everything is set to perfection, there is no reason for excessive brightness. And it's not the purpose of the film. When you look at the film, it's milky, it's hazy, it's misty, they are super ochre tones. Should they have color grade this with fluorescent green and high contrast to say it's real HDR? Now the big question, is it really worth it to buy a movie like Last Jedi or Blade Runner 2049 in 4K HDR? I say yes. Yes, because you have a better transfer. You have 4K, you have better compression, you have better color depth, you go from 8 to 10 bits. You have in many cases better audio tracks, it's not always the case, but you are supposed to have better audio tracks. You have a much better signal encoding, because even if you are not going to have a very high peak brightness, when you have 250 or 300 nits, don't forget that SDR doesn't go further than 100 nits. It's not the same curve, it's not the same signals, it's not encoded the same way. HDR is encoded with a PQ curve, and PQ will display you with much more details. What you will have in SDR, even if you boost your signal to 2 or 300 nits, between 100 and 300, there's no more info, it's clipped. Let's move on to the practical side. To illustrate the difference between HDR and SDR, we will take a concrete case and we are going to shoot elements. We'll bring this image into Davinci Resolve, and we will color grade in a Dolby Vision workflow, that is to say I'll have a HDR on one side and SDR on the other. And we will be able to compare exactly the difference between those two. We'll see what information is left once we've switched to SDR. We'll be able to compare the light intensities, the gamut, in short to see exactly what is the real difference between HDR and SDR. Because you are constantly confronted with movies in HDR with old version in SDR, but we compare what is not comparable. Sometimes there are years between the creation of this master and it's not the same thing at all. To make a real comparison, you have to start from same source, so we can see what is different. I'm lucky to have CINE as a partner who provide me with equipment. I had a RED Gemini 5K with optics and small lighting set. I made HDR at home, but still with professional gear. I then put myself in a Dolby Vision configuration thanks to the help of Dolby's team, and thanks to EIZO, I had the chance, that's say the privilege, to have monitors of very high quality to grade this sequence. Time for product placement. I have first of all an ISO 279X, a screen of 27 inches with a contrast ratio of 100/1300. This is my graphical interface. Here I have a screen that will be used for SDR mastering. It's an ISO 3109X. It's able to do HDR, but it's limited to 350 nits. So I will use it to display SDR. I have a contrast ratio of 1:1500, and here I have the flagship of the range, the ISO 3146 Prominence, which is a reference HDR screen. It's a dual panel LCD. We are in 4K DCI with a contrast ratio of 1:1,000,000. We are able to display more than 1000 nits, and we have 100% of DCI P3. In short, it's a reference monitor. It's a competition screen. Just to give you an idea of prices, this one is at 1,600 without VAT, this one is 3,500 euros without VAT, and this one is 25,000 euros without VAT. So I'd like to tell you that there is a bit of little money on the desk, and it's quite scary. I don't dare to breathe or get too close to the screens. I have really something very homogeneous and coherent, and it's a real luxury. So I'm going to show you roughly the settings of this project. You'll see for the uninitiated that this may not necessarily speak to you, but you may find elements that we talked about before. So the size of my image, my digital intermediate, is going to be 3840 by 2160. It's Ultra HD. You see that there are some black bands because the screens can display 4096 pixels. But my final master will be 3840 by 2160. The image that I have shot with the RED are larger. You see here I'm in 5100 by 2700. It's 5K. I will check here 444 in SDI, and I will display an RGB signal on my monitors. Here I put myself in dual link that will allow me to display both HDR here and SDR on this monitor. My project is set to full, not video level, and I'm in 12 bits. For the timeline, I'm going to set it to P3 D65 and associate it with a PQ curve. For the moment I will set it to 1000 nits, but we might go higher later. I will limit my sequence to P3 D65. I don't do BT 2020. It's the Dolby specs. I didn't invent them, it's what Dolby recommends. I will show you here too. So I'm in RGB 444, 12 bits, I'm in full SDI, and my EOTF is PQ. And I am in DCI P3 PQ. For this screen I'm in Rec 709. So as you can see, it's 1080p. When we do a Dolby Vision workflow, we display both SDR and HDR, so we output two signals at the same time. The video card I have on this machine, which is the latest Mac Pro, it's a 4K 12G Extreme card, so indeed, as its name indicates, it's capable of doing 4K. Except that to send two signals at the same time, it divides size by 2. That's why it's 1080p. So to display 4K, I need an 8K card. I couldn't get an 8K card, so it's 1080p that arrives on these two monitors. After, it's upscaled back to 4K, but it's just for the display, it doesn't matter. The master I'm going to output is real UHD. There's no upscaling or downscaling, it's real UHD, there is no problem with that, it's just for the display. This is the limitation of the graphic card. But the rendering of the file will be real 4K UHD without any problem. For the decoding of the camera, I will ask Resolve to decode the RED files in full in 16 bits. Color science is IPP2, red white gamut, and log 3G10. So you see I have this milky look when I open my image, and then I'm going to grade it, and we're going to have something completely consistent. So I have my dog Cookie here. You can see that it looks exactly the same on my HDR monitor and on my SDR monitor. Why? Because I only have midtones in this image. When you look at the oscillo here, you can see I don't go very low in the blacks, and I barely go above 80 nits. This is really SDR in HDR, and that's why images are identical. You can see that my colors are contained in Rec 709. I have only mid-tone, I have no extreme light intensity, I have no light peaks, no specular lights. So it has no reason, but no reason to be different in HDR and SDR. Now I can have fun Pushing the levers to grade this image, if I pull a little on the signal, you'll see that I already start to have something much more flat rate. You see I start to exceed in the red the bar of 100 nits. Here you see I start to reach the limits of the HDR. I start to clip my signal. But this image, my dog in real life, is not this color. This is really boosted. There's no reason to grade this image like that. It's an artistic intent, I can do it if I want. But it doesn't match reality at all. If I want to go back to something more or less normal, I'll stay over there, so I go back down to something much more natural. And now I have no difference between SDR and HDR. I shot these toys on a black background. It's not really a toy, it's a collector item, a master replica. It's grey. You can't say that we have an explosion of colors. It's metal that is matte. There is no real shine on this picture. You see, as it is, I don't have extreme light intensities. You could even say that I'm very low. If we pull the signal a little bit and set white to 100 nits, this is white. It's not a brightness, it's really a little white fizzing. I have no reason to go higher than that. Now you see, it looks exactly the same on my both screens. And then you say, okay, HDR is useless. There is no reason to push the levels, because if I push the levels, if I decide to increase the light intensities, you see I'm clipping badly in SDR. I have no more information. So we'll ask Dolby to do some tone mapping, I refresh, and you see we get some detail back. But here on my HDR screen, the image that is displayed here, which for some people will seem prettier, brighter, or whatever you want, it is miles away from reality. My image as I shot this model looks absolutely nothing like this. It has no reason to be like that. Once again, we can do whatever we want, we stick the artistic intention we want on this image. If you're doing advertising, you still want to get as close to reality as possible. I shot some model cars. I went to borrow some cars from a collector named Jean-Pierre Guerra. He lent me some small models which are J-Worlds. This is gold for HDR. I have very high peak brightness and absolutely incredible specular. Regarding chromacity, with this red car, I can tell you that my red looks incredible on the HDR screen, and here we feel a real limitation. We really feel a difference here. I'm going to show you something. I'm limited to P3, and if I had displayed this signal in BT 2020, if I had monitors that were able to display it in BT 2020, if I don't limit to P3 anymore, look what will happen to the color volume. Look at the red. We are at the bottom. So there, regarding the light intensity, when you look at the chromes, between here and there, this is so different. The signal stops at 100 nits. It's clipped, there's nothing to do. So what can I do with the trim? I can try to add a little bit of peps in the image, but you see what happens, very quickly we clip. If I try to go up and set the same level of brightness as here, I can't anyway. I'm going to completely clip here. I can't see my black stripe anymore. I have a big white globery that I don't have here. Here I really have some detail, and knowing that there I have already really increased my highlights. Maybe too much, you see I'm burned out because I'm over 1000 nits. If I go down a little bit, if I lower the highlights and I go to the limit, here I don't clip anymore. You see here the highlights. Now I clip. And I have no more information. That's the point of HDR, avoid clipping. If you start clipping in HDR, it's a pity, it's not the goal of the game. The goal of the game is to have intensity, to have matter, and not to have a completely clipped white signal. So depending on what you are shooting, you may have some limitation. For sure, if you film the sun, your intensity are much higher than the sensor of your camera. No matter what you do, you will be clipped. The color here and here is the same. Midtones are the same. So you can see here, on the bumper, I have a big block. I have such high intensity, I'm completely clipped here. I don't have any detail. On the bumper grid, it's quite phenomenal the difference between these two images. Same thing with the highlight here. I have saturation in my highlights that I don't have at all here. Here I'm clipped at 100 nits. I have no more color information. It's white, it's over. There I have color in my highlights. Next image is very interesting. It illustrates perfectly the dynamic range. We have very strong light intensity, more than 1000 nits. But on the other hand, we have a black level very high. And this is what I explained to you. You may have a very high light intensity. If your black level is not stuck, it's not black, you won't have high dynamic range. It will be limited. I have a veil in front of my image, and you will see that as I go forward, the veil will disappear. And there we'll have a real dynamic range with real deep black level, with real highlights. There is your dynamic range, there is your contrast. But when you look at the black level are the same on both screens. Technology is different. Here we have a double LCD panel and here we have a single LCD panel, so my blacks are less deep than here. I have a near zero black here. It will be displayed differently according to the technology of your monitor. But I guarantee you that if you display this HDR image on an OLED, your black will be true black. This is going to be a very interesting case because we are in a backlight situation. Foreground is very dark, so what you do in this case, you're going to bring up the foreground, but the background is going to overexpose. It will burn out. It will be overexposed, but with HDR we'll be able to recover some detail. You see, if I raise the levels a little, if I lower my black like this, I have detail. I still see a difference between my white wall here and my milky sky. Difference here is much less important. Here I can't even see the shutters. Here I can distinguish the trees, and here I hardly see the branches. The HDR image that I'm making comes from an HDR trim. We are much more precise with what I just did than if I had graded directly in HDR. I have finished my HDR grading, time to launch Dolby analysis. Globally, I will analyze the whole sequence. I'm going to define a destination profile for it. So we are going to tell it that we want to do a sequence in 100 nits in Rec. 709 and my AOTF will be 1886. We are in full, I can do 600 nits, 100 nits or 2000 nits. This is all the trims that I can do. I'm going to analyze sequence, I press all and it will analyze everything. I have my HDR match and I will be able to fine-tuning with the trim options that are here. I can modify my HDR grading independently from my HDR grid. If I am happy with my results in HDR, I can adjust here a little bit to try to get closer to HDR. I can adjust my saturation, I can modify small things. I can try to recover a little bit of detail in the highlights, even if I'm limited. So these trims will allow me to refine my HDR sequence and do it shot by shot, and to adjust my image as well as possible to have an HDR grading that is as flattering as possible compared to the HDR version. Keep in mind that today, content mastered in Dolby Vision, the HDR version comes from the HDR, so it has nothing to do with previous HDR masters. We have gained a lot in quality. With HDR we can have HDR contents of much more better quality. I'm going to export an IMF. It's a package that will contain the image, the sound, the metadata and all the trim informations. We'll have a big file, and this file I will send it to my friend Benoit, who will make me a Dolby Vision sequence. He will make me a MP4 in Profile 5 that you will be able to download and watch it by pasting it on a USB key and plugging it on your TV. That way you can be sure it will be decoded correctly. Of course, I will also make an HDR10 version because not everybody have access to Dolby Vision. So my grade is over. I made my Dolby Vision, my HDR10. I know exactly what my images look like, how they are originally. Now we're going to try to answer the question everyone is asking. What about preserving the artistic intent once it's on the shore? So we're going to put ourselves in extreme conditions. We are going to go on the field. I managed to convince Yacine, in charge of a video store, to let me film and broadcast this sequence on a large panels of TVs. I broadcast them on HDR10 and Dolby on TVs that are compatible. And we'll see what exactly happens. At my request, the demo modes have all been disabled on the model tested here. TVs are obviously not calibrated. They were all filming logged in order to be able to restore the maximum of information and not to be limited to HDR. Even if this process cannot guarantee an absolute fidelity of restitution, it allows to highlight the sometimes important difference between these different models broadcasting the same content. No VFX were applied to the image except resynchronization of the source, because it was impossible to obtain a simultaneous playback. Keep in mind several things. SDR content that is displayed on a HDR display is no longer SDR. The signal will be enhanced to give you a more immersive experience. The levels will be enhanced to approach those offered by HDR. The boundary between SDR and HDR will be narrowed. But don't forget that the signal present on your deliverable can't render as much detail as the one offered by the HDR version. If you buy a movie in HDR with the very highlight intensities, and you have the SDR version sold with it, if you are watching on a TV that is not capable of displaying highlight peak, the tone mapping can cause the HDR version to appear dimmer. Much dimmer than the SDR version where the tone mapping has been better managed. Remember, the signal is the same for everyone, but no one sees the same thing. What you see depends on the technology of your display system, your settings, and the technical characteristics that will generate a stronger or a weaker signal processing. As you can see, HDR is not as simple as it seems. But I would like to remind you something that is for me fundamental, is that cinemas, series, cartoons, all this is art. It's made by artists. Artists were given tools. And these tools, they use it as they want. If they want to make a milky image, they make milky image. If they want to make an hyper-saturated image, they do. But it's not up to you or me to tell them how they should use their tools. After, that's a different story if we like it or not. But there is no one in the back of an office who is thinking, I'm going to do HDR, but I'm going to put SDR in it and I'm going to rip you off. It doesn't exist. To me, it seems like heresy to enter a system when we are going to standardize the color grading, to have demo tape films that will be flattering on your HDR TV. It doesn't make sense. Take for example 6 Underground from Michael Bay on Netflix. It's 4K HDR, it's HDR demo in every shot. It's a Michael Bay movie, so it's shiny, it's gorgeous. Photography and grade are always stunning in his movies. But do we want all movies to look like this? Definitely not. It's a style, but it should not be applied to every movie. And I don't want Blade Runner to be graded like a Michael Bay movie. As usual, I have a lot of people to thank. Albert from SOS CINE, who is a real sweetheart, who trusts me and gave me great equipment with which I had a blast shooting these elements. I would like to thank David Coiffier, a director of photography who gave me a big hand and who lent me some absolutely incredible optics to shoot these elements. I would also like to thank the Dolby team, Anaïs Libolt, Jan Loé, Michael Leckel, and of course the rock star of Dolby Vision encoding, Benoît Le Tonnerre. I would also like to thank the people at ESO France, Stanislas Boll, Fred Roll and Jean-Pierre, who trust me and lent me these absolutely exceptional monitors. I am really lucky to have had access to this prominent monitor. I thank them for it. I would like to thank Yacine from Boulanger Orgeval for letting me film all my tests and for letting me have access to all of these TVs and letting me play my content as I wanted. So thank you so much. This video is now finished, so see you soon for more adventures. Until then, take care of yourself and see you soon.